All right, well, next thing that we need to know is what philosophers or logicians call conditionals. You've probably heard of a conditional. Sometimes it's called a hypothetical, and it's just an if-then statement. Conditionals have parts. The antecedent comes after the if, and the consequent comes after the then. Sometimes you can mix these up. So sometimes the if is in the middle of a statement. Sometimes it's at the beginning of the statement. But the antecedent is always after the if, and the consequent is always after the then. So here's an example. If all pigs could fly, then Wilbur would be able to fly. So the antecedent is that entire part after if, all pigs could fly. The consequent is the entire part after the then. Wilbur would be able to fly. And we can reword that. Like I said before, sometimes the if comes in the middle of the sentence. So you could say something like, Wilbur would be able to fly if all pigs could fly. In that case, we took the then out because we rephrased it. So there is no then, but the antecedent is still the part after the if, all pigs can fly, and the consequent is still Wilbur would be able to fly. So you're always going to have an if in there, and the antecedent is always going to follow the if. The consequent is going to be the other part. In most cases, it'll be the part that follows the then. We can use conditionals to express what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. This is the definition of a sufficient condition from the book. It looks a little bit complicated. That first bullet point, X is a sufficient condition for Y whenever the occurrence of X is all that's needed for the occurrence of Y. But one way to think about this is sufficient conditions guarantee. So the second bullet point gives you a simpler way of thinking about sufficient conditions. So X guarantees Y. This is kind of a morbid example, but if you chop somebody's head off, that guarantees that they are going to be dead. So chopping somebody's head off is a sufficient condition for them dying. Here's another example. If a number is divisible by 2, then it is even. So being divisible by 2 is a sufficient condition for being an even number. All right, the next one is necessary condition. Necessary conditions, our third bullet point there, B is a necessary condition for A whenever A cannot occur without the occurrence of B. That's our textbook definition of a necessary condition. The easiest way to think about this is that necessary conditions are required for something. So if B is a necessary condition for A, then B is required for A. Here's an example. Oxygen is a necessary condition for human life. Oxygen is required for human life. So we can say that it's a necessary condition. You can't have human life without the occurrence of oxygen. Now, if we think about the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions, we can try to imagine oxygen being a sufficient condition to see why it's a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition. So just imagine what it would be like if oxygen was a sufficient condition for human life. If that were true, then the occurrence of oxygen is all that you need for the occurrence of human life. Or, having oxygen would guarantee that you have human life. But that's just crazy. This is going to lead to absurd consequences. There's oxygen inside of my water cup. So if oxygen were a sufficient condition, then that means there would be human life in my water cup. And that's just gross. Okay, so oxygen is not a sufficient condition for human life. It's a necessary one. Now think of chopping somebody's head off. Chopping somebody's head off is a sufficient condition for killing them, but it's not necessary. The reason why it's not necessary, it's not required to chop somebody's head off to kill them. Now, it might be required for certain kinds of things like zombies, but it's not required for normal human beings. So it is sufficient, but it is not necessary. Now, some things might be both necessary and sufficient. So I mentioned the being divisible by 2. So we thought about being divisible by 2 as a kind of condition for being an even number. Well, let's think about both of these. If a number is divisible by 2, that guarantees that that number is even. But it's also required to be even. You can't be even unless you're divisible by 2 if you're a number. So being divisible by 2 is both necessary and sufficient for being an even number. So some things are one and not the other, or some things can be both necessary and sufficient. So let's look at some examples, test our knowledge. We already used the oxygen as an example. It's a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. Being a human is a what kind of condition for being a mammal? Well, being a human, let's imagine it being a sufficient condition. Being a human, does that guarantee that you're going to be a mammal? Yes, it does. Being a human guarantees that you're going to be a mammal, because if you're a human, then you're a mammal. So, being a human is a sufficient condition for being a mammal. But it's not necessary. Being human is not a necessary. It's not required, because there's all different kinds of mammals besides humans, like cats and dogs. Third one, sunlight is what kind of condition for plants to grow? Well, let's imagine it being sufficient. If sunlight was a sufficient condition for plants to grow, then having the presence of sunlight is all that's needed for plants to grow. It would guarantee plants to grow. And that's just not true. If you've ever tried to grow plants, you know that sunlight is not all that's needed. We also need other things like moisture and soil. So it's not a sufficient condition. It is a necessary one. We need some sunlight. Well, technically, you can grow plants with a grow light, but for our purposes, we'll say that sunlight is a necessary condition. Some kind of light is a necessary condition. All right, being green is what kind of condition? Well, it's not necessary for being colored because there's lots of different colors, but it is sufficient. If something is green, then that guarantees that that thing is colored, so it's a sufficient condition. Now, we talked about conditionals earlier, and the reason why we talked about conditionals before is because necessary and sufficient conditions can be rephrased in terms of conditionals. So whenever you have a conditional, an if-then statement, the part that follows the if, the antecedent, expresses a sufficient condition, and the part after the then, the consequent, expresses a necessary conditional, a necessary condition. So let's rephrase these in terms of conditionals to show you how this works. We said the presence of oxygen was a necessary condition. So that means that the presence of oxygen needs to go in the consequent of our conditional. So if you have human life, then you've got to have oxygen. It's going to work like that. Being human, we said, was a sufficient condition. So we could phrase this one, the sufficient conditions have to go in the antecedent of your conditional. So we could say it something like this. If you are a human, then that guarantees that you're a mammal. Or you could say it more simply, if you're a human, then you're a mammal. And we can rephrase all of these necessary and sufficient conditions in the terms of conditionals. Okay, so that's it for this video. We've talked about what makes an argument and how to recognize arguments in a little more detail, along with conditionals and necessary and sufficient conditions. In the next video, we will talk about the two basic kinds of arguments, deduction and induction, or deductive arguments and inductive arguments. So stay tuned for that.